One is that you'll get an understanding about some of the things that I do, and some of the things that my team is doing on a day-to-day basis, but also some of the things that you'll hopefully learn today, and you'll make changes to the way that you'll do things in the future that ultimately will make yourself more secure and a little bit maybe more private. So.
But you know, I'm not really concerned about Facebook or Google or Microsoft themselves. It's more the smaller vendors that don't get it. Like my mobile phone operator has some rules how passwords have to look like, and I open a support request. So, are you storing my password in clear text? They didn't answer the question. They just said no, that this is for your security, that you cannot put the hash marks in there.
Well, there's a survey that was done recently last year, okay? And if you're not concerned about Facebook, I would be concerned about Facebook. They are trying to do things better. They are evolving, and they're thinking privacy and security first. But if you go through in a lot of the surveys that's been done, and you ask the question, everyone, who here has changed their Facebook password in the last year?
I don't have a
You, that, yeah. Exactly. When you log in, they don't really entice you to say that your Facebook password has never been changed since you created the account. They don't really advertise that. They don't push that to the foreground. On average, the average Facebook password is between 3 and 5 years old.
Oh, okay. I mean, we already have started, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Let's
this is Joseph Carson, and I guess this talk will be at least as scary as the previous one. So have fun.
So thank you. I'll try and explain a little bit about myself. So I've been in the security industry for 25 years now. I know must have started like when I was 4 years old, no, but it's true. 25 years in the security industry. I run my own business, and my company contracts for many other companies globally. So I do a lot of advising for governments, critical infrastructure. I'm working on autonomous shipping, so I'm one of the security architects and experts that's helping the future of autonomous shipping. So it's a really interesting project as well. So one of the things I'm here to talk about is to try and teach you a little bit about what is the difference. In many situations, pretty much 80% of the people in this room have already been impacted by a data breach in the last year or two. The scary part is that you're probably not aware of it. No one's ever told you. No one's ever made it transparent to you. A lot of the services that we use in the cloud have had a lot of breaches, and we've shared information with them. And the important thing is that to make it understandable about what the impact of those things are. So to talk about is, what is that difference? What's the crossover? What's the difference between just a simple data loss, and what's the simple between a perimeter breach to what is the potential to create a catastrophe? When do you need to make that decision to when you need to start pulling plug on systems? When you need to start like shutting things down, taking the power out? That's the question you have to ask yourself. So, turn this on. Is my battery gone, or? Maybe go back to, it's woke up, okay. Okay. So, the biggest thing we have is the security perspective, this whole cybersecurity perception. We all assume, everyone in this room assumes that you're not important enough. You're not a target. Your data is not valuable enough for hackers to look at. They're only interested in the big organizations. The interesting thing is that everyone should be really concerned. There's this perception that we're all sitting up here on the side of the boat, and we're all like, I'm safe. But the other person down here is who's been infected and affected by a breach, and significantly, not only just from basically data loss, but also financially. I get into a lot of situations where even I get to see a lot of the really disasters down here. Over the years, we've seen a lot of people committing suicide, which people don't really even get into the media side of things, is what really is the impact? What is the social, the personal impact of these breaches? And we have to bring it up to reality. One of the biggest things that I'm concerned about is that there's a completely change in the target. Years ago, it used to be really focused at things like credit cards and identities. But the landscape's changed in the last 2 years because the financial fraud detection has improved a lot. So last year, we started seeing things like medical records. We started seeing other types of records that's been targeted, and the value of those has shot up. But, in fact, the biggest concern is that this year, where we're starting to see a lot of the targets into, is that it's a shift in the marketplace into where people are targeting. Of course, they're still going after medical records this year because the fraud detection in that area is not so good. They're also going after things like legal and insurance areas as well. But one of the biggest concerns is that the target is also now 6 to 14-year-old kids. That's the biggest areas. Now 6 to 14-year-old kids are one of the biggest targets because, of course, the lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding of security. So one of the things we have to do, even from an educational standpoint, we already had to start educating our kids from the age of 6 to prepare them for what they're going to face when they get into things like social media. So when they create their first account, when they create their first password, do you understand the risks? So as we move into, one of the things I want to highlight, and is no matter what technology you use, what thing that you've implemented from a security perimeter, from a technology standpoint, is what do you think the biggest risk in your organizations are? People. We are the ones that are the biggest risk. No matter what thing you implement, we always find a way around it. We always find the exceptions. We always find a way to be able to do what we need to achieve. So we are by far the biggest risk in many organizations. But if you take it a step further, okay, we are the risk. We're the ones that make the impact. We're the ones that facilitate a lot of the breaches that happen. But the biggest risk is users that have the privileged access. That's the biggest difference, is that once we have a user that has local administrator rights, once a user who has a privileged account, that can be the difference between having just an access to a system and having access to the entire network. How many people in here use their home machine running as administrator? Who's an administrator in their own home machines? Who's administrator or local admin on their own work accounts? Many people are running administrator accounts. And when you're under the context of administrator, you have full access to do everything in that system. So as you're surfing the internet and basically going to websites, or you receive emails and you click on things, it runs under your context, the user context you're in, which is administrator, which gives it full access to that system. So if you look at last year in September, the Department of Energy released a report into all of the attacks that they've had over the last 4 years. And over those previous 4 years, they had over 1,000 attempted attacks on their infrastructure. They had 159 successful perimeter breaches. But the ones that was highlighted in the report that made the biggest difference between what was catastrophic potential and what was not, was 53 of those successful breaches had access to privileged accounts. They were the accounts that had the ability to shutting infrastructure down, to deleting data, to changing configuration. That was the difference, and that was the things that they highlighted in the report, was that out of all of those perimeter breaches, the ones that was most potential catastrophic, that could have shut the energy down, was the privileged accounts. So this is one of the areas, and one of my kind of move forward areas, and one of my goals is that in our day-to-day lives, we have to switch our kind of historical mindset and move to standard users, that users that have least privileges as we do our day-to-day activities. Administrators, domain administrators, should not be going around as domain administrators. They should be also standard users. We should get to the point where it's elevation by the real-time need that you need to have that access for that time when you need to do it, for the task you need to do, versus always having that access, that permissions, that capability to go and create users, to do logs, to install applications and so forth. A lot of those things require change requests and audits. So those are the things that we need to get into the process of least privileges and elevation on demand.
But wasn't that what Vista was trying to do, and it was a usability catastrophe?
Well, there's a question into, can we do it without impacting usability? And of course we can. Vista was the first attempt at achieving that with the UIC pieces, but it failed dramatically because we end up having an impact. But there is technologies and there's capabilities that allows that achievement of these privileges without sacrificing usability, and also a safe way of doing it as well. So I think the best way to tell the story and go through this is to talk about advanced persistent threats. We're all familiar with advanced persistent threats. We all know the stages that we go through and to be able to get into people's organizations. And one of the areas that of course, the first stage here, we can talk a little bit about, is the reconnaissance phase. My team spends about 70% of their time in this area. So I have a vulnerability assessment team that basically goes and researches companies before we even get into looking at their physical systems and networks and all and so forth. And we use social media landscape. Everyone's sharing information. People sign up for Facebook accounts. The first thing it asks you to do is, oh, is this your friend? Is this your friend? Is this where you live? Do you like these bands? And you start clicking like, and you start accepting friend requests. You start uploading pictures and photographs. You start checking in locations. You go to your LinkedIn account. You start creating your job description. You start sharing the technologies that you use. Companies are going and posting job descriptions. And then those job descriptions, they're listing all the technologies and versions that they're looking for those skill sets. People are checking in with people that they're meeting with, so we can get to understand a little bit about their schedules and so forth. To the point where we've actually shared so much information that the team that I've got, who's pulling all this information back, we're getting to the point where we can already tell where you're going to be tomorrow, who you're having lunch with, and potentially what you're going to eat for lunch, and how you're going to get there. Without, it's something that we've already shared so much information about our trends in the past, to the point where hackers and adversaries can actually already go to your information that you're sharing, create algorithms, and understand about where you're going to be before you even know yourself. They can already go and pull the lunch menu back from the restaurant. And based on your previous photographs and your previous check-ins of food, they can already tell what you're likely going to eat from that lunch menu before you even get to the restaurant. This is the types of algorithms and things that we're also getting to the point where that the more information we share, the more likely it is that the more vulnerable and the more we loosen our privacy and security as a result. So have an understanding about all the social things you're sharing. When you first sign up for these networks, put the privacy on, put the highest security level on, enable two-factor authentication. Make sure that you go through all those steps, because the first thing all of the Googles and the Facebooks are interested in is the more information you share, the more value you are to them. They have the least interest of your privacy. So you need to go through those steps of signing up and knowing how to enable those. A good area that you get into is, of course, we're all familiar with Google Darking. There's many of these browser tools, there's many different solutions out there that you can go to, and simply start creating searches for yourself. Create Google searches for yourself, alerts, so that when something appears on the internet about your name, you're already familiar with it. You know the risk exposure. You know what the kind of information is out there about yourself. Even your kids and your family and your work colleagues and so forth, all of these should already be predefined searches that you're already actively looking for, because hackers and adversaries are doing exactly the same thing. So it's better you knowing what the risks are than not knowing those risks. So go and make searches, search for yourself, start finding out what already is available out there so that you know how to go and either disable that information or better protect yourself. There's a lot of solutions out there that can create a lot of those mapping. So if you're familiar with Maltigo, who's familiar with this? Okay, so this is one tool that we use typically from a vulnerability assessment. And we put in a lot of information about what we can find publicly about our targets. And then it will go and create our map of that target about what pictures they've uploaded, what they tweeted, what locations they've been checking into, photographs, what tools they're playing, who they're checking in with. This can pull a lot of that information back, and then we can create a blueprint about your life. These are things that we have out there, and there's many tools, and there's new tools that's coming available that just can correlate that information. And it's quite shocking to, when you search for yourself, when you search for other people, what it pulls back. The intelligence out there is quite scary. So the important area here is be very careful about the things you post and share. So social media is an area that you have to be aware of. One thing that I highly recommend, if you do sign up for things like Facebook or Google, do not use the application single sign-on pieces. I highly recommend against that. Who here uses Facebook to sign into their Instagram and to sign into other types of applications? We all have a tendency to do that, to make it simplified for ourselves. But that means that the value of your Facebook account starts to increase. because the more applications you use that single sign-on means that your Facebook account, once that's compromised, means that all those applications that you've integrated into the single sign-on are now compromised. So those are the things you have to get in the mindset about using OAuth and SAML and single sign-on authentication and so forth. You have to be aware of what that implications are. So when you get into signing up and creating accounts, one of the things you should also ask yourself is, what's the value? If someone can access this account, what can they do with it? You always have to, every single account and every single service you have to know the value of data. That's one of the biggest areas that you can understand, that if this gets compromised, what does it mean? For example, if my Twitter account gets compromised, what can they do with my Twitter account? If my Facebook account gets compromised, what can they do with my Facebook account? If my PayPal account gets compromised, what can they do with that? So we take a look at over Christmas. We saw, who's familiar with Brian Krebs? Okay, so Brian Krebs is a kind of well-known security researcher and journalist in the industry. And over Christmas, the day before, I think it was like Christmas Eve or the day before that all of a sudden he found his PayPal account was compromised. And he went in, he changed his password and was trying to secure it. He was like, okay. And then a day later, it was compromised again. He was like, what's going on? So what he finally found out was that somebody called up PayPal and had a social security number. And just with simply the social security number, they were able to get his email address changed to another email address. And then they called back again, and the same thing with the social security number, they were able to reset his password, and it went to the email address they just changed previously. So now they had access, just by telephone call, social security number, they now had access to his PayPal account. What did they do? They tried to implicate him in criminal activities. So they started sending money from his PayPal account to ISIS. So that's the situations that you have to be aware of, is what is the value of each account that you have in services. And then allows you to then put the right security measures and the right privacy around each of those accounts. So we get back into the next phase. So we've got reconnaissance. It's all about privacy. It's all about the service you use and know the value of those services. The next area is gaining access. How do you think the easiest way to gain access to someone's system? Ask them. So you're familiar with RSAs coming up in a few weeks' time? So RSA posted this page saying, let your friends know that you're going to be at RSA. This was taking the username and password in clear text. So anyone who was going security attendees, to be honest, because I mean RSA is a major security event, were now entering the username and password that was then being transmitted in clear text. So even security people, get into the factor that they, sometimes you simply just ask them and they will give you the username and password. This is a fact. It's that you get a lot of the scams that comes out is all of a sudden you get an email from Facebook saying your Facebook account has been compromised. Click here to quickly change your password. That's quite a common area. Is that and people, they get worried. They're in stressful times. They're running around. They're busy, and all of a sudden they're like, I need to do something. I can't, and they click on it. You should never change. You should never click on links that comes through email. Many of them are phishing scams or targeted phishing scams. The only place that you should really change your password, ever asked to change your password or prompt to change your password, never do it on someone else's machine. Never do it in a public Wi-Fi location. So if you're in a conference like this, never ever change your password during these times. Never do it through an email. Always go to the official URL of the website and change from there. Those are some of the things you just need to be aware of, is that in those situations, by asking people for the passwords, we're very, very willing to sometimes give it to them. And in many cases, more than 50% of the cases, we use the same password for many accounts. Or this was the Facebook account, this was the single sign-on for that one account that gives access to all applications that they've subscribed to. So we have to get into the habit as well as using unique passwords. So again, be careful what you share on the likes of Facebook and Google and any other social activities. Try to be more private and get into the area of making sure that it's not a public search. If you sign up for Google and Facebook, what is the first thing they become? Is Google searches. They put an index on your wall on Facebook. So everything that you post is a Google search. So one of the first things you should change when you sign up for those accounts is make sure that it doesn't come up as an index Google search. So now we've basically asked them for their password, okay? And the next part is pivot building is quite straightforward. Pivot building is basically, now I'm on the network. I just do a search and see what else is around me. But the biggest area is between any type of malicious activity and the gaining access portion. And this is where I get into the point where privilege escalation. That's where we have the elevation of the credentials or the rights of the access that we have. Even if I get into an account, a social account that has limited access, that account may be the one that I can go and reset their email password, or it may be the account that I can go and reset another password from their system because it's centralized. So that's a way of elevating privileges within social area. And then on network systems as well, if the account that I had that person click on was a privileged user, now I've got privileged access on the local system. I'll tell you a story about one of the assessments and assignments that we did last year. It was in quite an interesting way of method, and we used a lot of these areas here. So last year, we had to do a penetration test in a company in Belgium. So the team and I went along, and we had our SDRs, and we were scanning for radio frequencies, and we found that they were using smart light bulbs. So smart LEDs. Great, so they can turn them off at certain times from their phone, they could put it on a schedule and so forth. So they had smart LEDs that allowed them to be energy efficient, to be able to control things from their phone, which is great in the IoT of things. And all of a sudden, we find that when we're looking at the radio frequency and looking at the communication of that light bulb to the Wi-Fi, we find that it was using WPA. So it was using a really weak encryption protocol and authentication. So we were able to, within 30 minutes, we were able to get the Wi-Fi password. So 30 minutes after watching a light bulb communicate, we had the Wi-Fi password. So we end up getting onto the Wi-Fi point. We were able to get our machine there. We did a scan. We found there was a TV. We found there was a desktop in the room. And what we realized was, very quickly, we realized that we had access to the conference room of that company. So now we had the conference room. Not really a lot of access. There wasn't many machines around, but we had access to that machine. And then what we were able to do was we could then turn on the TV camera and watch what was in the room. We had the microphone turn on, and we were able to scan that system for all the accounts, service accounts, application accounts. And what we found was that there was an application of vulnerability in that system that allows us to do a traversal, that they didn't properly put the service account, and we were able to jump out and get higher level of credentials and find out all the passwords on that system. So now we had access to that desktop, we were able to turn the camera on. So as executives were coming into that room and sitting in the conference room, of course their laptops were facing the camera so we can see what they're typing, we could hear all the conversations they're having. And then all of a sudden, what were they doing? For better Wi-Fi speeds and connectivity, the Wi-Fi in the conference room was much better and much faster than the private network that they would typically be on. So in order to get better speeds and faster connectivity, they switched to the conference room. So now they're on the same network that we're on. We're like, this is great. And then we checked the accounts, and they had all the same accounts. All the passwords that was on their systems were the same ones that was on the desktop that we just compromised. So very quickly, we were able to laterally move from that conference room desktop to their laptop. And then what we end up doing is we waited. What did we wait for? Then to disconnect their laptop from the conference room, take their laptop, walk back into the private network, place it down, and what do we have? Full access. This is the types of scenarios and kind of thought process that we go through into understanding about how we can get around things. So we go through the privilege escalation. For me is one of the major areas, and that's why you and all your users and everyone in the organization that we're working in should always use least privilege, the lowest level account, because it's the lowest level account that has limitations on what those accounts can do. So for example, we go into Mandiant's report last year. So Mandiant do a couple of reports every single year, and this one is basically all of the breaches that they researched and were participating in. 90% of them had used stolen credentials. Stolen credentials. And those credentials typically come from domain accounts, service accounts, local administrator accounts, and privilege accounts. Just to kind of give you an example, just coming to I have a virtual machine here that, am I left or right? We'll soon see. Oh, okay. So just to give an idea, this is a privileged user on the system. And one of the areas that a lot of mistakes are made is in services. So as users developers are creating applications and service accounts and so forth, when we get into a lot of these service accounts, it comes down to a lot of what the privileges are that these services are running under. So one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people create is that they have it as a local system. And local system gives that higher level of access. And then if you get into the details about those higher level access accounts, you can go into and find out if there's applications that they have installed that has done some either weak security of those service accounts or applications, and therefore you can go in and either do traversal moves, you can replace the service. On the next time that user restarts the machine, you now have full access to the machine. There's many scenarios in a lot of these applications that people make mistakes. Just to show you some good ones. So Google have done a pretty decent job with some of their service accounts. For example, they put the double quotations around the service. A lot of people who create service accounts fail to put the double quotes around. And if they don't do that, that means is that you can go into that directory and cut it off and do a traversal move so you can get into that directory and elevate your rights. So not only the user rights that are running, if I've accessed this machine as a standard user, I can go through a lot of these service accounts to find out which developers or which services have been created that allow me to do those types of scenarios. So when you're creating service accounts, you need to know how to make sure you harden them and secure them so that you can prevent those things from happening. You wouldn't believe how many applications out there. I think it was Tim earlier had mentioned about the CVEs. Although the CVEs highlight a lot of those errors that are in the applications. And there's so many out there that you can go and search for today that you can go and simply find out which ones. Even to the point where the accessibility tool, you can replace it with a command line. So that accessibility, when the machine starts up, by hitting the shift button for help, will prompt up the command line that has full access. So some of the areas that you need to be aware of from a service account perspective. So just moving back in. So one of the areas that a lot of organizations don't realize when they do a scan is that they assume for a simple 1,000-user organization, they assume that the privileged accounts are much less than what's there. But when you take into the concept of all of those local users and application accounts and service accounts and everything else, we typically find that it's 3 to 5 times the number of employees. Because each laptop will have multiple applications installed, will have multiple service accounts. So we end up finding that the actual risk of organizations who still go down the path of having privileged users and having privileged applications will actually be a higher risk. The other area that is pointed from that Tim mentioned earlier is about keeping things up to date. So a lot of people had questions about do you update or do you not update? Well, this is one of the areas that highlights the statistic that says you should update. Out of all of the breaches and exploits that happened in the last 2 to 5 years even, over 90% of them were already known. Means that the exploit was already known, there was an update that was already available, but 90% of them still had not patched and updated those applications. So by keeping applications up to date, keeping them patched, keeping them the latest version, even though you may introduce a new security risk or a new vulnerability, is much better than the one that you probably had before. And we had situations last October where iOS 8, iOS 9. iOS 8 had a vulnerability, iOS 9 had a vulnerability. To patch the 1 and 8, you had to go to 9, but you're introducing a new vulnerability. So you always have to face, you're always faced with these, is that the new ones do have vulnerabilities. But I always say that, well, which one has the weakest or the less punch if you're ever exploited by it? So that's the decisions you make. So the note here, when I mentioned about privileges and why privileges are important, is that if you look at all of the vulnerabilities, you get into the details now. So we get into the CVEs. A lot of the vulnerabilities and exploits require privileged users and privileged access to exploit them. So by even using a standard user, meaning that of the 7,000 vulnerabilities that was in 2014, and there's, also a similar amount in 2015, that out of all those vulnerabilities, by simply using a standard user, you are no longer exploitable with those vulnerabilities. So that's a key area that you have in your mind is that out of all those vulnerabilities, that if I'm using a privileged user, I'm more of a risk to those by simply operating day to day. So my kind of definition here is to kind of get you into that understanding and mindset is the difference between a perimeter breach. So when I get access to that desktop in the room, and getting access to data is a privileged account. So where possible, we need to basically reduce those where we possibly can. When you're creating applications, never create the application or software that runs under privileged accounts. Get it to the point where it's the least amount. And where possible, there's lots of technology that can do elevation in real time and check the reputations and things like we had throughout the day with two-factor authentication in addition to those accounts, and also adding in trusted additional parties like whitelists and so forth. This is the difference that between that APT that gets access to installing tools, doing malicious activity. This is the one step that is the difference between I have access and catastrophes from happening. Once you've got a privileged account, it's game over. That's the point when I get into, when I'm doing a type of coming in to help an organization make the decision into, we've got a breach. When do I stop it, or when is it okay to watch it? And from my input is that, does it have privileged access to data? Yes or no? If it does, pull the plugs. Start disconnecting, powering down, shutting everything down to stop it immediately. That's the biggest decision that we have to decide when it's game over. So I've got some recommendations here, just before we kind of end up. So some of the recommendations into these areas is that think twice about the things you share. Put value on your own data. How much is your home address worth? How much is your telephone number worth? What's your email address account worth? What's your favorite sport worth? Put values in all of that data, and that will help you understand when things are exploited or when things are shared, what the risk you're creating with that. Does this email address that I'm using to subscribe to this service have the ability to reset passwords for my bank account? Those are the things you need to start looking at. So maybe I want to use a different email address when I'm signing up for that service, and not the one that I use to reset account passwords for. You have to make those scenarios. So put values on your data. Use the least privileges for day-to-day use. When you're using your machine on a day-to-day and you're browsing the internet and you click on something, if you're administrator right and you click on the wrong thing, it could be a crypto locker, it could be ransomware. It might look like a screensaver, but it could be something that's dangerous. But if you're a least user, it's going to make you think, it's going to prompt you to say, I'm trying to install something. Do you want to elevate, or do you want to not? That helps you, that transparency between something happening and something that could be bad. Use strong passwords day to day, unique passwords for every account. Never use the single sign-on, because unless you know that the account or the value that you've associated with it has zero value. If you're fine with the account being exposed and exploited and there's no value, why not use single sign-on? But if it does, you want to separate those. Use two-factor authentication where possible. Create fake accounts. That's a good thing to do, is that when you're surfing, you're subscribing to services, don't use your real account. Use something that is quite lesser value, something that doesn't relate to you. Another good practice you can get into. Don't use public Wi-Fi. Try to use your cell or other terms of connectivity. If you do, use a VPN connection. Use Firefox instead of IE. And if you're using Firefox, try to use incognito mode. Incognito mode will give you a lot safer protection. Question?
Where's Chrome on that Firefox?
In the middle. I kind of, so if I was, people ask me if I was to stack rank them in order of privacy and security and so forth, I put Firefox at the top, then comes Chrome, then comes IE, and then right at the bottom Safari. Safari for me is horrible from a security perspective. So from that stack ranking, Firefox has pretty good. It comes down to sometimes of choice, that when I'm using, Chrome has the built-in translator. So when you're traveling, sometimes you can revert to that because it's better use. But when I'm going to look at something that I want to stay private, and then I revert to Firefox and use incognito mode. It helps, and also using things like destruction of cookies as well. There's a lot of plugins that will help you clean up data that allows protection of your data and your privacy as well. But it's just comes down to choice of what you're looking for. Other areas, use mail clients on your system versus the web clients. That's much more secure and also allows you to have encryption end-to-end. Other things about, try to limit yourself with Android devices. I'm not, so just to make it clear, I'm not biased against Android. I think it's good that if you choose a platform that allows you accessibility and allows you to, cheaper choices. Of course, iOS has its flaws and Windows Phone has its flaws. But when you sign up with Android, you got to know the risks. You got to know that you're sharing a lot of information. I always have this saying that if you buy an Android device, you're signing up for your employment contract with Google, and you now are an employee of Google because you are now the product of Google because your information is what you've just sold. So never use XP. It's end of life. It's got many vulnerabilities and it's not getting updated. Always keep your software and hardware up to date. That's an important area as well. And then finally, change your passwords. And then these are always good things to find out what you've already shared. If you go and you log into your Google and you type in history.google, this is the type of thing that if I ever compromise your Google account, this is what I'm going to be looking at. And this is the data that I'm going to be pulling back. This will allow me to see everything that you've been searching for, keywords, websites you went into, things you've been exchanging, your GPS that's been continuously recording your locations, your profile preferences, what you look at. If you search for these, this will allow you to see what if a potential person ever compromise your account, this is what they will have access to. And are you happy with that information being publicly leaked or made available or used against you? So where possible, I always recommend to clean those up, delete everything where you can on a regular basis. Even a month to month, you go in here, find out what you've been keeping researched and keeping recorded, and go and delete them if you don't want them to be ever compromised. So an important area to do. So questions?
So we are actually already out of time.
Okay, I'll take two questions
yeah,
then.
Okay.
Okay, the question in the back.
I already have two, but
Okay.
So, we've been dealing with cybersecurity for a long time, and some of the tips are already heard, but my personal problem is, so I do have different accounts, and I use them, but I started when I wasn't, I heard it many years ago, then I did it a bit, and now I kind of lost track which accounts can be tied back to me. So actually, when I use an account, like I had my first fake account I had 15 years ago, like, is that really still fake, or does everyone know that it's mine? So how do you assess that?
If there's accounts, there's accounts you've had for such a long term that you can be connected back to yourself, then just delete them. Just go on and remove them, create a new one. Some you want to be able to tie back to you for like for school friends or something. Well, first email you ever had. So let me explain my methodology. I've got my accounts which are tied to certain things. So I've got something like it's close to 20 email addresses, 20 accounts that can associate back. Out of those, I've got them categorized into accounts which have got value behind them. And those ones that have value is the ones that I do not use for any types of signing up for services and so forth. So those are the ones that I want to keep, and I keep the passwords regularly. I keep two-factor authentication where possible. Those are the ones that are basically my, tied to my value. The next ones are ones that have no value at all, zero value. And I use those for subscribing to newsletters, vulnerability information, and so forth. So it gives me a feed into, but there's no value behind them. Then I've got my fake accounts, which basically I use for either communicating on, was it deep web and other people, just a kind of research perspective that cannot be tied back to myself. And I regularly re-update those because at some point in time you know that it's going to be tied back to your MAC address and IP address. And if you want to be truly anonymous, you want to keep refreshing those accounts.
I'm sorry, but we really have to stop here. The next speaker has only 3 minutes left to set up his laptop.
I'm here for the rest of the day. If you have questions, you can get me outside.